Do you deal with unstable shoulders where it gives you tight traps, tight pecs, or maybe even a winged scapula? If this sounds familiar, then this video is going to be for you. In this video, you'll get an in-depth look into one of the sessions that I had with one of my clients that was dealing with this exact issue throughout her shoulder and shoulder girdle. So without further ado, let's jump straight into it. Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the In Session series. If you're new around here, this is a series dedicated to going behind the scenes with some of the work that I do with some of my clients so that you can better understand some of the function of certain parts of the body so that you can apply this to your clients or to yourself if this is a common pain point for you. In today's episode, we are working with my client, Linda. She has had ongoing shoulder issues for quite some time. She tends to deal with a lot of compression in her body, and it leads to a lot of this kind of internally rotated position both through her shoulders and kind of through her rib cage. So what we're gonna be emphasizing throughout the session today is not only getting these shoulders linked, but also getting her into more of a state of expansion around this newfound shoulder position. So generally when someone is dealing with a lot of rigidity or a lot of compression in their body, a place that I typically like to start with in a session is some form of dynamic movement. And that's exactly what we're starting with here. We're starting with just some arm swings, kind of getting used to rotating from side to side. I'm also introducing some level of weight transfer or weight distribution to the motion. And really all I'm using the arm swings for here is an assessment to see how does her shoulders go into external rotation? Do they go into any form of abduction? Where's the rotation in her trunk occurring from? And just kind of getting a general feel of how the shoulders are interacting with the rib cage and really her whole body. From here, what we start to get into is some rhythmic hinges. So instead of working in the horizontal plane of motion, I want to start to see how do her shoulders move in the vertical plane of motion as she goes into deep states of extension and flexion. How is she tying this into the hips, the rib cage, and just getting a look for kind of the front and back line connection. Anytime that someone comes to me with a pain point, we'll say in this case in the shoulders, it's important to not only look at the shoulders because sometimes that's a byproduct of something a lot deeper that's occurring. And typically when we get into dynamic movement or movement that involves the entire body, where things kind of have to kinetically link together, we can see potentially some of these deficiencies show up. And that's what I was seeing here. So as you can see, I kind of froze her at this top position and I have her in kind of this classic Y shape. Anyone who deals with a lot of internal rotation, of course, we want to kind of work the opposing spectrum of that. So in this case, it's going to be some level of external rotation. And you can see I'm just applying a little bit of pressure here through her shoulders, really in an attempt for her to create a little bit more space between where her ear and really her shoulder are. And all I'm doing here is just giving her a little bit of sensory feedback, again, of the width that she potentially has through the shoulders, and maybe a range of motion that she may not be entirely accustomed to. Now, as she is in this extended position, we're really trying to focus on the pressure and kind of the breathing mechanics around this position. We're trying not to let the shoulders and the rib cage kind of deflate. Again, a lot of the time when people have this tendency or bias towards internal rotation, it can be associated to a pressure issue and them not having the ability to breathe into kind of these top two ribs. So I'm kind of getting her to focus on breathing really between kind of the collarbones and kind of finding some pressure there and almost sensing that she's breathing into the hands while she's maintaining this position. So now that she has a little bit of sensory feedback into her body, we started to create some pressure kind of through the rib cage, give her an idea of spacing kind of around this shoulder position. What we got into here is some vertical rows. And the primary purpose of this is to establish some level of stability into the shoulder. She did have a little bit of winging going on, especially as she was approaching extension of the shoulder and deep flexion of the elbow was something that I was noticing kind of through our initial assessment. So in the vertical row, it's a great opportunity for the lats to kind of understand how to go through a full length tension before we start to draw it back into its contracted position. And what you can see here with my hand, again, I'm just giving her a little bit of feedback on the head of the humerus there because she tends to draw in or almost suck the humerus into the socket quite deeply. So we're just giving her and her body an understanding of how to maintain that humeral positioning as she starts to go into a deeper state of elbow flexion. Now, what you can notice with the vertical aspect of this rowing motion is we are kind of working that elbow scoop motion on the opposing side. And we're kind of using that almost as a guide to take her into extension. Again, because of this kind of collapsing bias that she has through the upper ribs, we're really trying to focus on getting space through there in a integrated way where we're not getting, say, an excessive anterior shift of the ribs, but also linking the arms to that motion. So it's almost as if the arms pulling away from one another is gonna be what is lifting the spine and creating length in between it. So now that we have established some sense of general stability around the scapula, and she has some feedback into her lats, we're gonna start to work through a range of motion that her body tends to not have much awareness of, which is this externally rotated position and having kind of a flushness of tension to support the scapula in that position. So what we're working through here is kind of your conventional rotator cuff external rotation exercise, but the way in which we get into it is a little bit different. We initially start by going into the row, and again, that's as a means to kind of provide some sense of stability and feedback really throughout the entire shoulder on that one side. And then we're gonna start to connect some of the delts. So I'm getting her to go into a slight delt fly and being mindful that the scapula is kind of abducting as she's going through that, or it's moving away from the spine. You can see here on the one repetition, I didn't give her any form of cueing on this left side. I just kind of wanted to see what would happen. And as she is going through that, especially as she's going into the delt fly motion, we can see the instability start to occur through the scapula. It's kind of pulling into the spine, away from the spine, and it's not really sure where it needs to be supported from. And this is extremely common. You'll see people go through the rotator cuff exercises up here, down here. You'll see people do delt flies without really being aware of where their shoulders, specifically their scapula, is in space. If the scapula isn't set to begin with and we're getting kind of this winging feature occurring, which we can see slightly here, then you're really just gonna be reinforcing a pattern that may not be entirely beneficial for your shoulders in the long term. So we ended up going back to the left side again. This time I was cueing her through it. Again, just being mindful of all those sensations that I've touched on so far. And you can see as she goes into the delt fly here, I was kind of telling her to almost imagine that she's reaching or projecting her elbow away. And we can see that the scap stayed a lot more flush. It didn't have as much of that medial bias towards the spine. And now that she has that space, has the width, has the shoulder shelf that we kind of talk about on this channel, then we can start to go into the external rotation. And there's gonna be a real fullness that comes in through the rotator cuff muscles, as well as in through really all the tissues around the scap to support that position. Now for this next one, it might seem super basic. Why are you getting her to just move her arm kind of back and forth coming into this curl position? Well, for her, this is actually a very challenging motion to work through because her scapula didn't fully understand how to create stability as the humerus was going through kind of this flexion and extension. So what we were doing here was I was just kind of cueing her through the sensory feedback in through her shoulder to kind of use that as a baseline of tension or support to take the humerus to this elbow flexion and shoulder flexion position. Then what we kind of work through is her kind of lengthening the humerus out to kind of get kind of this posterior tilt effect of the scapula on the ribs. And then we were gonna start to work into a pressing motion. And I'm kind of just giving her some feedback there at the top because we're trying to maintain some level of scapula stability while the tissues really through the backside of her arm and down and through the lat as well kind of get stretched out as she starts to go into this overhead motion. Again, this is very difficult for her to work through because she has such a strong internal rotation bias that this is actually pulling the tissues oppositionally to what her body is accustomed to. So I knew eventually I wanted to get into some lower and mid trap exercises with her. We had worked through the rows, we had worked through some of the rotator cuff work, and then we kind of worked on that general motion of how the scapula and humerus relationship can kind of work both through flexion and extension. So on this exercise here, we're really just tying together all the principles of the exercises that we worked on previously. We're focusing on bringing some of that sensation of stability into the scapula, specifically when she's in extension, not letting it just kind of kick off the ribs, and then almost feeling the glide and the scooping motion as she is starting to drive that arm into flexion. And just being mindful that the scapula is going into just a very subtle posterior tilt, maybe even a little bit of depression. Again, I'm not getting her to crank it down where she's just depressing the scapula as hard as she can. It should all happen relative to one another. So as we're going through this motion, there is going to be a gentle protraction as the arm is going back, and then a slight retraction and depression of the scapula as she starts to go into the deeper phase of shoulder flexion. And last but not least, to wrap things up, we've finished with some dynamic movement. So what we're working here is just a pendulum swing with the dumbbell. And really we're taking the exercise that we were working on prior to this and just adding a dynamic and rhythmic element to it. And again, I'm just kind of assessing before and after the session, is there any noticeable difference with how her scapulas are kind of moving as she's going through flexion and extension of the shoulder? How is the rib cage articulating around that relative to the rhythm? And we're just kind of using this as another form of assessment at the end of the session, as well as trying to take out some of that potential rigidity that she may have in her body. She does tend to have more of a bias towards being rigid or compressive. So just hanging out in corrective exercises all the time isn't necessarily going to be the best thing for her. Actually, what we would want to do is get into more of a dynamic movement once the shoulders and her body starts to understand how to articulate through those ranges of motion. And as we look at this more close-up shot of her shoulder, it does appear that the scapula is going more into kind of that natural glide of retraction and slight depression as she's going into flexion. She is getting some protraction there, but I'd say still a little bit too much elevation. It looks like the upper traps are maybe overcompensating just a little bit too much. And that's okay. It's not gonna be perfect by the time we get to the end of the session. It'd be great if we could just do a 60-minute session and it's gonna be entirely fixed. But unfortunately, that's not the way the body works. So this is gonna be something that we're gonna have to continue to work on together in session, as well as she's gonna have to work on outside of our session with soft tissue work and some of the rhythmic and corrective exercises. Anyways, that is gonna wrap another episode of the in-session series. This one is obviously more of a upper body and shoulder focus. Hopefully you guys learned something new and you can use this with your clients or on yourself. The idea here is me just sharing information into my process and what I have found helpful working with clients. If you did find this helpful, you can do all the YouTube things. You can like the video, subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace.